Okay, this is lecture 4 from McGerr. Get the notes up here, chapters 6 and 7. And we're going to start with talking about segregation. So segregation is known as the term given to separating primarily black and white races, but races in general. And it's this policy that comes into place known in the South and in the nation in general known as Jim Crow. And these are a body of laws that are put into place to enforce separation between the races. These are local and state laws generally, and they are therefore enforced by local and state authorities. And the separation includes things like separate water fountains, separate schools, separate trains, etc. This is creating a bridge, or actually breaking the bridge between the races by establishing walls that are maintained through the force of law. So here we have the executive branch at the state and local level enforcing this separateness. So it's not just a function of how folks would like things to be, it's what is enforced by law. So in the South, this Jim Crow takes the form of law, legislation. For the rest of the nation, outside what we would term the South, which is the Confederacy and the border states by and large, the rest of the nation, there are no laws that function in the same way, but there's a general approval of the practice of keeping people separated. So for the progressives, in one way, as McGerr says, this would seem to be out of step with what progressives were talking about or agitating for. But it does fit within that progressive paternalistic view of viewing other people within the nation as in, we know best and this is the way things should be. And they also, it's designed to address their very intense fear of conflict. The progressives are fearful of conflict tearing the nation apart. And so seeking to prevent this conflict is a key component of progressive thinking. So in the progressives' view, it's better this way, right? You know, it's not perfect, it's not ideal. They certainly agree that this is not what the rhetoric of the nation is about. But it's better this way because the violence that is ratcheting up in various places is destroying the nation, and it's destroying the minority populations, the black, largely the black population, but also Native American and in some cases Asian populations as well. So the idea is to separate the groups, and so this will result in lower friction. And so that's how the progressives swing on board with this idea of implementing segregation within the nation. This is primarily in the late 19th and early 20th century, a Southern issue. The racial tensions are high because the redemption governments, as we know, is a self-proclaimed name of white Southern Democrats getting back into political power. Their number one goal is to roll back anything that the freedmen population, the black population, achieved under Reconstruction. So they want to strip away citizenship rights. They want to force them into a lower status. And so this is a violent process, and violence was being applied. So the racial tensions in the South are very high. And this is because 90% of the black population lived in the old Confederacy and the border states. So this is where the overwhelming majority of the black population freed from bondage by the Emancipation Proclamation and the conclusion of the war, and sealed with the 13th Amendment and then the 14th Amendment guaranteeing them equal rights. That's where the majority of the population lived. Most of the black population, certainly not all, but the overwhelming majority were mired in sharecropper status. There was some increasing urbanization, industrialization trends in the South, but they still lagged far behind the rest of the nation in general, and certainly the North in particular. So the majority of the black population were stuck in this sharecropper status, which we have seen from our previous book, lock them into economic chains, in effect. Um, the white power structure is seeking to undo Reconstruction to solidify themselves in power to prevent the Black population from having any say in the political, social, cultural world of the South, and putting them into a lower status. And they're doing this through the application of violence, most primarily in the form of lynching. For example, in 1892, there were 230 lynchings reported. That's almost one a day. And the lynchings, they're a particular public display of violence, because the lynching is not only about inflicting misery and death on individuals. It largely serves as a warning to the surrounding community. This is what happens if you transgress whatever sorts of rules or laws that the white population is putting into place. And there's a marvelous and distressing book, and also it had a website known as Without Sanctuary. And it's a collection of photos and picture postcards from lynching from the late 19th into the early 20th century. It's really a very powerful book. I used to have a link to it on Blackboard, but that link is no longer available. So I encourage you to look it up sometime. It's really distressing, but the images are remarkably powerful because they demonstrate not just the heinous violence being inflicted, but they also demonstrate the public acceptance of this, because lynchings became the scenes of the white population celebrating their superior status. So people would have picnics the next day where someone was lynched while the person is still hanging there. And they would sell tickets in some cases that there's going to be a lynching, and thousands of tickets would be sold for this horrible application of violence designed to terrorize the surrounding population. Now, Jim Crow, what it does do in enforcing the segregation, and enforcing the segregation by law, right? So lynching is by definition extra legal. It's outside the law. With Jim Crow, now the law itself is enforcing this segregation. So it does bring a measure of stability. The Black population, as a result of Jim Crow and the application of state power to enforce it, Blacks are disenfranchised. In some places, a mere small percentage of people retain the right to vote. They're intimidated. They're terrified by the absolute terror inflicted by lynching, and now with the support of the state, people being sent off to chain gangs and prisons, etc. And they're forced into a separate status. They are segregated. That's what Jim Crow brings. Now, these state and local laws, right, as we know, federal law trumps state law, and we also know that the Constitution trumps federal law. So the Constitution says in the 14th Amendment that, you know, everybody should have equal citizenship rights unless and can't be taken away without due process of law. So obvious challenges were baked into this process of installing Jim Crow legislation. And so the case wound its way up to the Supreme Court, known as Plessy versus Ferguson. Briefly, Plessy was a man who, by legal definition, was described as Black because he was, I believe, 1/12 or 1/16 Black ancestry. So under the laws in Louisiana at that time, he was by legal definition Black. And so in order to challenge this law, Plessy had purchased a first-class ticket on a train. And when he went to get in his seat, this was arranged ahead of time, the conductor said, because you're Black, you can't ride in first class, you have to ride in the smoking car. So Plessy filed suit. And what he filed suit on was that he wanted to challenge this definition of being labeled Black. That's really the intent behind the Plessy case. But it wound its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court completely ignored that aspect of what the case was about, the definition of being Black under the law. And instead focused on the fact that Plessy was not able to sit in the seat that he had purchased. And so what the Supreme Court ruled is they created a set of language which we will see again later in the course, but at this time is designed to ensure that these Jim Crow laws are not overturned by the 14th Amendment, because it says Plessy was separated. That is correct. But he still got to his destination. So as long as facilities that create separateness remain equal, then they do not violate the 14th Amendment. So the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, issued in 1896, created a magic phrase, separate but equal. And under this separate but equal explanation, Jim Crow legislation is constitutional, at least in the eyes of the court that ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson. Because what they're saying is it's okay to create separate systems as long as they're equal. And we'll see later in the course when we talk about Chafe's chapter on the civil rights movement, we will see that challenging this in the law comes in the form of challenging this terminology of separate but equal, right? But what this magic terminology does is it justifies the application of Jim Crow law at the state and local level. And in fact, it would justify it at the federal level as well. So in the South, we have what's known as de jure Jim Crow, which means by matter of law, right? So the South enforces Jim Crow through the law. In the North, they don't pass laws. Segregation is maintained by what's called de facto, which means as a matter of fact. And so thinking about why in regions outside the Confederacy and the border states, in places like the North, why it takes this form, well, part of the explanation is that in regions of the North, there's simply not as many members of the Black population, right? So because the Black population is a distinct minority, they're not seen as threatening, right? There's no need to pass laws to enforce separateness because in the North, they are able to keep the Black population from mingling with other populations through the application of extra legal violence. So this is a process that the Black population concentrated in the South begins to change over the course of the Progressive era and accelerates through World War I and up through World War II, as a matter of fact, as the Black population begins to move out of the South and in pursuit of jobs in northern and upper Midwest cities. Right. So when these migrants from the South move up, and as a small sidebar, that's why Chicago is the home of the blues, because a lot of people from the Mississippi Delta came to Chicago, bringing with them their musical tradition of the blues. So Chicago is the home of the blues because a lot of folks from the Mississippi Delta brought that with them to Chicago. So these migrants from the South, they're moving to the North, and they're in some ways being treated like the ethnic immigrants who are flooding in from Italy or Romania or some other location in Central and Southern Europe. They're being ghettoized. So they're forced to live in certain neighborhoods. That's the only place that they can purchase properties or rent properties. So they're forced into these ethnic enclaves in very similar fashion to Italians, Jews, and others are forced into ethnic enclaves in these larger northern and Midwestern cities. And it's very irregular, but there's a regular pattern of the occurrence is irregular, but the pattern is fairly regular in that there are periodic race riots. 1919, for example, was a very volatile year in which there were a number of race riots. In recent times, by the by, the race riot in Tulsa from 1921 is receiving a lot of attention. These race riots are the sudden unleashing of violence on the Black population to enforce some sort of separateness as a matter of, practice, right? So the Black population couldn't use certain parts of the beach in Chicago on the lake, right? And so there were certain unwritten and unofficial guidelines that everybody knew you had to adhere to. And if these were challenged in some fashion, a vicious race riot would break out. And the race riots in these regions or in these cities, in these locations, are the white population attacking black neighborhoods, right? So it's really a one-sided assault to enforce the segregation that is a matter of fact as opposed to a matter of law. During this progressive era, the presidents ranged from somewhat uninterested, Teddy Roosevelt, to those who strongly favor Woodrow Wilson. So Teddy Roosevelt was a product of his times. He referred to people in very racist terms, including the black population. He referred to them other folks he considered lower groups, basically anybody who was not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He referred to these various groups with the ethnic slurs of the day. But what made Teddy also unusual, and we saw a little bit of this in the UMW strike of 1902, is that he would also deal with individuals one-on-one. And so Teddy had met a prominent spokesperson I'm going to talk about in just a bit, Booker T. Washington from the black community, and he had invited him to dinner at the White House. Now, this I don't think would seem terribly dramatic, the president inviting somebody to dine with him and discuss issues of common interest. But in this time, this was outrageous. Teddy Roosevelt invited a black man into the White House to dine with him, theoretically as equals. This set off a storm in Congress, particularly amongst Southerners, who loudly proclaimed they wouldn't support any sort of policies Teddy Roosevelt was interested in passing, that this was, an affront that a black man had been invited to the White House, right? And came in through the front door, I suppose, is probably the best way to express it. So Teddy never invited anybody of color back to the White House again in such fashion, although he would meet people at various times, but not a formal dinner invitation, largely because he made a calculation that his second cousin would make as well, in that it wasn't worth the political costs. So the very loud and over-the-top response by members of Congress proclaiming they would not consider any of his legislation if he continued in such fashion, he made the political calculation that it wasn't worthwhile. There was a president, and Teddy Roosevelt's vice president became President Taft, also was largely following the Teddy process on that. He didn't really reach out to the black community, but he didn't actively support efforts to install Jim Crow or make it something more prominent on the national level as opposed to the local and state level. In contrast, the man who becomes president in 1912, Woodrow Wilson, is strongly in favor of this notion of segregation. Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner and believed in segregation and believed in this sort of romantic vision of what the white population had done in the aftermath of the Civil War, this noble set of folks who were protecting the population, especially virginal white women, from the ravages of the newly freed black population. So much so that his house, the White House, served as the debut place for a film that is technically an incredible breakthrough, but is in message a terrible atrocity known as Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is a fictionalized account of what the Ku Klux Klan did in the American South. And in this vision, W.B. Griffin is drawing upon a book that was purportedly to be a history of the Klan, in which the Klan are noble warriors protecting population in the South, especially white women, from the ravages of the freedmen population and the greedy carpetbaggers and the duplicitous scalawags. And so in this vision of what the Klan is, they're seen as the protectors of the population of the South from these drunken and degraded others. What makes it a technical masterpiece, by the way, is that Griffin introduced new topics or new ways of filmmaking that were unprecedented. So, for example, simple things like he used a crane shot. So he changed the perspective by putting a camera on the top of a crane, so you're shooting down on a scene. He was the first person to do a fade to black when a scene ends. The screen goes dark to signal the close of that sort of act or play, part of the play on the story. He used parallel filmmaking in which he would film a scene and then he would film another scene, and he would cut back and forth between the two of them to indicate that these two things are happening at the same time in different places, right? But what he's using these technical breakthroughs to do is in service of a terrible story. So the scene with where he's cutting back and forth, he has a large, menacing black man, actually a white man in blackface, if I recall correctly, who's beginning to approach this pure white Southern belle. And he's approaching her with nefarious intent. And then he cuts to the Klan in their robes, riding on horseback, whipping the horses, racing to get someplace. And then he cuts back to the scene with the large black man coming closer and closer. And now the Klan is whipping their horses even faster. And then he cuts back and he's just over top of her, about to rip off her dress and commit some atrocity. And the Klan hops off their horses at the fence, and they kick in the door and they save the white woman. And so this is the story of Birth of a Nation, at least part of it, in which it debuts at the White House with, the tacit imprint of Woodrow Wilson, former president of Princeton University and a person with a PhD in history, giving his imprint that this is an accurate story, which of course it is not. Jim Crow is installed with violence and then turning this violence into legal violence. And it promotes a response in the Black community that largely centers around two different prominent figures in the Black community. First is Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington was someone who was concerned about segregation and Jim Crow. But he said, we must accommodate ourselves in the short term and improve ourselves as a community. And then from this more secure position, we can then lobby for getting our rights back. And so he says, accommodate in the short term with the long-term goal of improving our status as a community. And then we will be in a more advantageous position to try and get our rights back. And his method of improving the community was to focus upon education, but education in what's called the practical arts. So industrial education, learning how to be a carpenter or learning how to run machinery, focusing on these things to develop workplace skills that will enable the community to generate more income and raise itself above the awful status of poor sharecropper farmers, right? So that's the view that Booker T. Washington is promoting: accommodation in the short term with the long-term goal of reversing this process. On the other side of this equation is W.E.B. Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois argues from the outset we should reject any accommodation to Jim Crow. This is illegal, it's unconstitutional, it is dangerous to the community to accept this injustice. So he says, embrace your race and fight for your political rights. Right, and so reject this, disenfranchisement, this forcing in a subservient status in the eyes of the law, right, a lower status. So fight for your political rights. And W.E.B. Du Bois also argues in favor of education, but he says you should pursue any type of education, including higher education. Du Bois was the first Black man to get a PhD at Harvard, and he emphasized that higher education is something that everybody should aspire to, regardless of what your color is. So because you're Black doesn't mean you can't aspire to be more than just a craftsman or a toolsman, right? He also went on to found the NAACP. So different visions about how to challenge Jim Crow, with Du Bois emphasizing from the outset that is not something the community should accept. Largely a Black-white issue in terms of segregation. There's also a sizable population who's also being viewed separately in this time, in addition to the Asian population, the Chinese and Japanese in particular. But this other population is a Native American population. And so one of the difficulties about talking about the Native American population at the turn of the 20th century is that it's difficult to know exactly how many Native Americans there are. Census numbers are generally reliable in the broad sweep, but it really depends on self-determination. And so because Native Americans were treated poorly and were viewed negatively, some people clearly didn't claim to be Native Americans on their census. So figuring out exactly how many Native Americans there are in the 1890 census and the 1900 census is a little tricky. It seems clear that overall the population was continuing to decline, had been declining well since Columbus showed up, but that's another story, right? And this Native American population, by and large, was restricted to reservations. And on these reservations, the reservations were set up with a fairly large land grant, a fraction of what they had before, to be sure, but a fairly large collection of property. On these properties, the white population with government backing is pushing for assimilation, to absorb the Native American population into the larger community. In order to absorb this population in a larger community, they're going to have to reform, in the eyes of these folks, the way Native Americans lived. Native Americans had lived as collectives, right? And so reservation land was a collective ownership of the tribes, as they were referred to. So to push this assimilation, the white population was pushing for private individual land ownership. They were pushing for Native Americans to stop speaking their own languages and to learn English. And so the way that this was considered was that we would capture younger children, capture in an intellectual sense, younger children, and raise them in the larger white majority ways, including language, including clothing, including hairstyles. And in this way, we will remake the Native American population into good Americans, I suppose, as it is. And to give this effort the force of backing, there's a passage of something known as the Dawes Act in 1887. This is a congressional act in which it directed Native American reservations to give up collective ownership of the land for individual plots of land given to each head right of a family. And so these were large plots of land that were given to the family that, after they built in sort of delays when they could be sold from the individuals who were allotted this land. But this would be their individual property as opposed to a tribal property. Carving up what the Dawes Act considered very generous terms of large individual plots, left over a lot of excess land, right, from the reservation claims. And so this excess land was then sold by the federal government, and the money put into a trust for the tribes, right? So this excess land was sold to individuals who may have been white individuals who were looking to, cattle ranch or start farming wheat or something. So excess land not taken for free, but sold, and the money's given to the tribes in a trust fund, but taken away from ownership of the reservation group. And the mechanism for running this process was the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was a very paternalistic organization. They viewed their charges of the Native American population as children that needed instruction and tending, and who weren't able to handle things on their own, right? Underlying a lot of this racial discrepancy between the groups is this is the pseudoscientific means fake science, pseudoscientific thing known as eugenics. And this eugenics is kind of a warped interpretation of what Darwinism is. Darwin was a concept that appeared in the late 19th century, an intellectual concept. There was a lot of debate about it. And so eugenics is an outgrowth of this notion in which it viewed groups and grouped them together as racist. And it's a races, not racist, R-A-C-E-S, as groups of individuals who are part of a hierarchy where there are superior folks and gradations of inferior below them. At the top, because they're the folks who are describing the system, you have the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Now, this eugenics belief gives cover for the activities of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ruling order. In this notion, it's our job, our duty. It is ordained by God that we are to rule over these other folks. And these other folks fail because they have inferior genes, right? So this hierarchy of various races is because nature has selected the most superior because of their genes, right? And this continued good breeding allows them to succeed. It's a very warped notion because the mingling, as they would see it, of various racial groups and their genes is always degenerative, right? So the offspring of a white Anglo-Saxon and an Italian is always Italian. The offspring of a white Anglo-Saxon and a Ukrainian Jew was a Jew, right? So this notion is always dragging down. So there's a lot of literature, some of which the progressives wrote and believed in these notions of, we have to protect the white race. And so these hierarchy, these genes, is good breeding. This is part of this, this notion of eugenics. They also wanted to prevent the, that's 200, not 200,000, apologies. I'll have to fix that. They also want to prevent the wrong type of people from breeding, because as they see it, these wrong types are outbreeding the superior white race, right? So over the course of the progressive era, there were 200, not 200,000, apologies, 200 people who were forcibly sterilized, most of them in Indiana and California, because they were deemed to be inferiors who were going to continue to pollute the gene pool through continued breeding. I should also note that in California, sterilizations continued up until the 1970s. So this notion of eugenics continued to continue to influence and shape some of the policies in the nation for a long period of time. It fell out of favor after World War II with the results of finding out what the Nazis had been up to, but it never completely disappeared. There were still people being sterilized as recently as the 1970s under this notion that they're inferior folks who should stop breeding. all of these tensions are going on at a time of remarkable change in the nation. This is a change that's driven by technology. And McGerr spends quite a bit of time talking about how individuals wanted to liberate themselves from the restrictive world of Victorianism and the expectations of society about what your proper role is. So fueling all this and shaking things up dramatically is this rapid technological increase that largely centers around the notion of speed, right? And this new, faster world that connected folks in much wider ways than previously was upending this sort of local society that had largely been the driver for American life until this time. And so McGerr gives us some examples. The automobile is by far the most dramatic change, I would say. So this allowed people to travel faster and further and pretty much anywhere they wanted, a freedom of movement that didn't exist before. So let's think about you live in a farming community. If you're going to go to town, going to town was an all-day affair because you had to load up the horses and load all the stuff onto your cart, and then you would plod your way to town where you would go and sell whatever stuff you were selling or pick up whatever stuff you were picking up, and then you would plod your way back, right? So that sort of planning meant that, you know, it wasn't something you did spontaneously, let's go to town, right? Because it wasn't convenient to do so. With an automobile, you could decide to go, I'm going to go to lunch today, right? And so you could get there in a faster time and do pretty much whatever you wanted. If you want to go visit a friend, right? Instead of it being something that needed to be planned ahead of time, you could just pop in, right? So the automobile provided a speed and a connection and a freedom that didn't exist previously. Another example, communication, right? Communication, we sit here today, you're probably watching this on some sort of portable device that allows you to search information anywhere around the world almost instantaneously. You can find out the news in Indonesia while you're sitting right here. Well, that's not how the world used to work. Communication, the speed of communication changed things tremendously. So first you have the telegraph, where you had the sending of messages long distances almost instantaneously. This is then replaced by or supplemented and largely replaced by the telephone, which allows you to speak directly to people as soon as you want, right? And so I'll give you an example of how this changes things. So before, if you had some sort of national or international catastrophe, that news would travel through newspapers or through the postage or through people traveling, telling the stories. And so in some locations, they may not know of an event until 2 or 3 weeks later. So you don't have a shared experience of a disaster. Now, with the telegraph, and then later the telephone, but with the telegraph, when the Titanic sank, just about everybody around the nation knew this at the same time, right? It was in the morning papers all over the place because that information had traveled by telegraph wire so that everybody knew about the disaster of the Titanic at just about the same time. And so you have a shared national response to tragedies as opposed to this sort of rolling reaction where before, when one place is now recovered and onto some news stories, that dramatic event is just arriving in a small town and they're trying to understand the impact of this, whatever this tremendous event is, right? So combined, all these things are what historians call the birth of the modern era. It's a world in which speed of movement, speed of communication, and as we shall see, the intermingling of people in a variety of locations and in occupations that did not exist before is adding to these great tensions of the changing world driven by economic changes, right? So changing to a modern industrial large-scale factory producing world creates its own enormous tensions that are also being manifested in this rapidly changing technology and the freedom that people are asserting under it. All right, that is our lecture for this. Keep up with your reading, and I will be posting the lecture for the next section in a short while.